I want to introduce my wife, Livy, right there. She's not been here the last couple weeks because she's been sort of going back and forth to Mississippi with our daughter, Mary. So I was looking at the topic, empathy and resilience. Livy's taught me a whole lot about empathy, and living with me, she's learned a lot about resilience. So I think we got that kind of worked out. I'm going to keep this one just slightly shorter than I have the last two, because I would wish for us to have at least some time to dialogue back and forth and save some time that if you got any questions about these topics or anything about family or marriage or parenting, we can at least throw it out in the air and see if there's anything to be said about that. Most of I also need a little bit of indulgence because I've been doing a fair amount of speaking, so I can't remember what I said to whom. So if I repeat myself, it's because I just got confused, and that happens a lot. But there's two things I usually mention when I start speeches, and they are particularly relevant for this one tonight. And the first one is the whole notion of there's this myth in our culture that the goal of life is to be happy. And we can talk a lot about definitions and semantics and positive psychology and all that kind of stuff. But my view is that to make a conversation about happy is really tough, particularly on adolescence. Because adolescence can be a time of struggle, and the only thing worse than feeling bad is feeling bad about feeling bad. So we say things to our kids like, don't care what you do as long as you're happy. And the really stupid thing we say to our kids are, these are the best years of your life, which give them nothing to look forward to. But what we put in its place, the goal of life is to live with integrity. And obviously that is inclusive of honesty. But psychologically, what we mean is integration. And by integration, we mean is we want our kids to be really, really celebrative of things like intelligence, social skills, athleticism, creativity, et cetera, et cetera. But we want our kids, before they leave us, to also be okay with the more difficult sides of where they live, the things that have to do with inadequacies, the things that have to do with defects and flaws, the things that within this context we simply refer to as our sinfulness. And so we want our kids to be really good with the good stuff, but be okay with the stuff they still have to work with. And the reason that is so significant is in relationships. It's easy to say to somebody, I love you, when all you see is the good stuff. But when it really counts is when you say to somebody, I know the really cool stuff about who you are. And to quote our kids, I also know where you suck. And in the midst of all of the above, I choose to love. And the reason we want our kids to struggle with that within themselves is if you can't have that conversation with yourself, you cannot extend that to another. And from that comes part two, which is our definitions of maturity. The two definitions of maturity from a psychological standpoint, the first is the capacity to struggle effectively, and the second is the capacity to tolerate ambiguity. That maturation, from a psychological standpoint, does not have a darn thing to do with having your act together. It's how well can you function in the midst of a difficult struggle, and how well can you make decisions in the midst of a both and of an ambiguity that you can see both sides of an issue. And so, if our kids are going to leave us, having done this for 40 plus years, the two biggest issues that I think our kids need in order for them to launch are these two issues, empathy and resilience. And the reason that's so important is even when kids are very young, you have to make a decision that's a little bit different, because it was an assumption up until this day and time that when our kids would get a certain place, we would launch them, they would leave home and get on with their life. Well, in this country right now, ages 22 to 34, 34.2% of people are living at home. And so you got to decide, are you going to raise your kids to launch, or are you going to raise your kids to stay dependent on you? I've got two little examples of why I think kids stay dependent. Our granddaughters play soccer. And a couple years ago, I was at a soccer game, and the parents were doing the parental thing of, good job, girls, and great work, et cetera, et cetera. And my daughter comes off the playing field and she says, "Poppy, we got our butts kicked." It's like saw through that kind of overdone affirmation. And then the other is another one of our granddaughters. I was at her soccer game this past Sunday. And the kids came off the field, and the parents were there, and I was representing the parents because we were babysitting 4 girls this weekend, which was why I'm so tired. But she came off the field, and without thinking, I said, "You know, you got beat by a better team." And the other parents kind of looked at me like, "What'd you just say?" As if you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to do the obligatory affirmation. The truth is, they got beat by a better team. I didn't think much about it, but it seemed like a radical statement in that context. Now, this visual, empathy and resilience, I think they are overlapped. And so I'm going to cover temperament, the executive function, connection, awareness, support, and all of that. But I do think these two things are absolutely crucial if we're going to raise independent children that are going to be able to function without us. Now, the reason they're so important is I'm going to do this. In the brain, this is so rough-hewn, but it's basically, there are 2 places where the brain has most of its regrouping activity. 0 to 4, obviously, or its activity. And in ages 4 to 10, you're sort of stabilizing what happens in those first 4 years. And then roughly 10 to 14, there's this huge upheaval called puberty. If you screen an adolescent's brain at puberty, it is absolute mush. It's all over the place. So what gets set in these times has enormous implications, because this will stabilize what happens here, and then this will stabilize. The brain is actually our last organ to mature. It matures at about 30 years old. The flip side of that issue, or at least another side of that, is that when we get to be, and from 30 years old, the rest of our lives, our brain shrinks. When we get to be 60, the bad news for guys like me is the male brain shrinks twice as fast as the female brain, which I suggest I may be on my last coherent thought. But the reason we want to talk about this is we're learning so much about the brain, and there are neural pathways for both empathy and resilience. And we're working on trying to get these set in here as much as possible. Because the rule of thumb is, yes, they can get developed, but these are the prime places for us to work at it. Because the brain is so amenable and vulnerable to have those neural pathways set. And then the reason we also want to continue that is we are also learning about neural pathways. It is a use it or you lose it. If you don't practice it, you lose it. Okay? So the most important places, and as an example, 0 to 4. There's a famous study. I'll give you my takeaway here, by the way. This is, if you don't remember anything else, the best thing you do to develop resilience is delay of gratification. Okay? So that's going to come back many times in this thing. But there was a study that a guy named Mitchell did of 4-year-olds. And he would take kids and he'd put them in a room, and he would say and there'd be a piece of candy there. And he would say, "I'm going to be gone for 5 minutes. And if when I get back you have not touched the candy, then you get 2 pieces of candy." And so the study was about kids that were able to delay for 5 minutes and kids that couldn't help themselves. And it's a fascinating study that the kids that would delay, they'd get up and move around the room, they'd sing songs to themselves, they'd distract themselves, etc., etc. They do all kinds of stuff. But the importance of that study is, because it was done so long ago, even though it's been replicated, is they were able to then follow these kids in a longitudinal study over time. And what they found is that kids that were able at 4 years old to delay for 5 minutes scored 50 points higher on their SATs. Yeah. So it starts with that. The neural pathways here in 10 to 14, one of the reasons that we work so hard in middle school on this empathy issue is that if kids are teased, and it's over the top teasing, is that also can get set in a neural pathway in a negative way. It can be really tough for kids then to undo. So we work really hard. The whole concept, whether I'm talking about marriage, whether I'm talking about parenting, whether I'm talking about kids, the whole concept is paying attention to what is it like for the other, whomever the other may be. Now, our brain is wired for empathy. Our brain is different from other animals precisely because of that. We are wired for empathy. We are wired for community, and that's what makes humans different from other animals. We have a specific set of neural pathways for empathy. And empathy is what makes us human. Now, by the way, our faith also requires it. If there's any message in our scripture, is it not about what is it like for the other? How do we treat the other? And it goes a long way. How often do we recall or have we seen that just a 30-second phone call to somebody has made the difference in their day? In a nourishing community where there is a lot of empathy, it makes us literally physically more healthy. If we live in relationships that are filled with toxicity, we suffer both physically and we suffer emotionally. On the physical side, I think I mentioned this when I was talking about marriage stuff last week. Women who live in a toxic relationship, their lives are shortened statistically by 6 to 8 years. But also, people who live in toxic relationship or in toxic community environments, you can just see it in their faces. It is just worn down. So we talk about creating empathy, and how do we talk and care for the other? And now we go to the circles. Temperament. Now, if you've got more than one kid, birth order stuff makes sense to you. Because if you've got more than one kid, typically, not always, but typically, you take your firstborn, you think 180, and you got your second child. And you can't believe these kids are out of the same genetic pool. So there is a role of temperament in terms of, we do know some kids just seem to be born sweet. Some kids just seem to be born rough and tumble. Some kids, there is a temperament quality to that. And what that has to do with scientifically is the activity in the part of the brain we call the amygdala. It's this walnut-shaped thing in the back of our brain. And the reason that we pay such attention to is that our face says it all. Our face has over 200 muscles in it. It has more muscles in this part of who we are than in any other part of our body. There are 18 to 35, depending on who you look at, different kinds of smiles. And that's what we exude. If you've heard me the last 2 weeks, how much I talk, because it's so huge for me, about 93% of all we communicate is at the nonverbal level. It is what we exude. It is what we transmit more than we are talking. When we get confused is when, and it happens a lot in the context of marriage counseling, I don't know how to read him. I don't know how to read her. I am hearing one thing, I'm experiencing a totally different thing. That what you are telling me is not meshing with my experience of you. I mentioned last week on the contempt thing, and Clay referenced it, is contempt is the best predictor we got for divorce. People that live in contemptuous relationships are, on statistics, not going to make it more than 6 years. Okay. And most divorces, 60% of divorces, are initiated by women. And most of the time, it's because women can no longer tolerate that look. That look that's condescending, that is demeaning, that is disrespectful, that indicates some level of superiority. Back to the amygdala. Shyness, personality-wise, is defined by an overactive amygdala. It's working so hard, it's running so fast that a person can't, so they pull back and protect. Social awkwardness or social anxiety, that's caused by an inability to accurately read social cues. People that invade somebody else's personal space. Folks that have Asperger's do not read social cues accurately. Autism and Asperger's has become such a big issue when I, even 15 years ago, didn't hear much about either. And now with Asperger's, we call them Bergies. And there's a whole category and a whole population that have various levels of that. And it's a helpful kind of distinction. But the reason what we exude is so important, we make our first impression of another person in the first 1/200th of a second. In a job interview, the essential decision around hiring is made within the first 45 seconds. That nonverbal stuff is so powerful. What we exude, particularly with our face, because it's our most active expression of who we are, is where that has to do. Temperament has to do with the amygdala activity. And our amygdala is constantly scanning, and we are always taking a read on whether or not who we are with is safe. Is this a safe interaction? Is this a safe place for me? Is there something I should be subtly aware of? Am I missing something? But it's that temperament that gauges how safe it is to be with this person. We are reading another person. It's not a conscious activity, but it's a very active and it's a defining activity. We get that sense of the other immediately. This nonverbal stuff, let me give you a couple examples. I can be doing marriage counseling with a couple, and they come in and the baby is in a car seat, sound asleep. And the tension in the room builds, and the couple is at a contentious moment with each other. It is predictable. It's not 100%, but it's at least predictable. That baby's going to begin to whine. And the tension between the two of them settles down, and the baby graciously falls back asleep. I've talked a lot the first time about anxiety, the degree to which it's contagious. We cannot be around it without catching it. I want to make a plug for parents here. Is when kids are struggling or things are difficult, we put so much energy on it must be what the parents are doing. And I talk a lot about the centrality of marriage, which Clay referenced too. The thing that I think often gets missed is the profound effect kids have on the adults. I have seen perfectly wonderful, sane, good people, and they just get that kid where it's just not a click. And it just not, for whatever reason, we don't know. And it takes really good people and drives them crazy. And then they end up looking like the bad guy. I just want to make a plug that it's not always the parents. Executive function. The executive function is in the prefrontal cortex. It's up here. It's where our Houston Control Center is. Cognitively, it's all this stuff up here that has to do with where we store things, whether or not we can retrieve things, memory. It would create our action plan. It has occurred to me that if this were a radio up here, this would be the tuning button. Okay? And then emotionally, that frontal cortex, that has to do with what we enhance, what we moderate, what we suppress. If this is the tuning button cognitively, this is the volume button emotionally. Most ADD and other struggles, learning difficult, have something to do with immaturity in the frontal cortex, have something to do with either the wiring is slightly off, or it's not maturing evenly, or the whole area is just not at the maturation level. But that control center does several things. First of all, it initiates. It tells the rest of the brain to focus. It borrows the ego strength of past experiences. Borrowing ego strength means if somebody can't do it themselves, you put somebody else just alongside them, and they borrow that 93% confidence of the person standing next to them. Where I see the initiation thing going awry right now, it's a fascinating phenomenon to me, is adolescent boys don't know how to get jobs. They don't know how to initiate that process. Once the job is gotten, they make excellent employees. But they're not being taught about self-advocacy. They're not taught about, all they know how to do is apply online, which typically doesn't get you a job. Okay? But I've got a whole practice over the last few years filled with adolescent boys that are quite competent, and they need to get a job, and somebody's got to go with them and have a cup of coffee just to be present while they go and try to get that job and work with it. I spent Friday a couple weeks ago with a young man, and finally, I just sort of said, I'm going with you. I spent a couple hours, and we just went, and I said, and he had a job within 2 hours. It's that same initiating as how many kids have struggles. They do their homework, they put them in their backpack, it's time to turn in the homework, and they don't turn in their homework. So the note comes home that they haven't gotten their homework done, or haven't turned in their homework, and they had it the entire time. Guess what that does to parents who have been checking homework and all that kind of stuff? There's part of that brain just doesn't click to initiate that process. That executive function gauges things. How long can I procrastinate? What are the demands? What is the longest I can get away with this? One of the places that this gauging thing does not work is you cannot ask a child to self-regulate screen time. If you say to a kid up through maybe 14 is, you got 30 minutes and I need you to turn it off. That is an unfair expectation. That brain of an adolescent or a kid does not have the capacity to turn that off on their own. The self-discipline is not yet there. We set them up. If you say 30 minutes, you got to go back in 30 minutes and make sure it happens. The self-discipline is not yet been internalized. Discipline, as you've heard me talk about, is nothing more than doing what you're supposed to do when you don't feel like it. You cannot expect a brain under 14 years old to have that capacity at least fully developed. Or a child that says, I'll do it as soon as this TV show's over, as soon as this game is over, etc., etc. And then the game is over, it doesn't get done. We think the kid's being manipulative. No. This adolescent prefrontal cortex is not developed enough that when that kid says to you, I'll do it as soon as, that kid is genuine, sincere, authentic. The kid really means it. But the internalized discipline is not yet developed. The kid cannot do that. He was not just trying to get out of it. He meant it when he said he would, but he can't do it. Next, correct. Making changes based on new information. As I've said to you, it's only in families that if something's not working, we do more of it more intensely. At the arena of life, if it's not working, we try something different. But in family, if it's not working, just up the intensity, up the decibels. Okay? I do a lot of speaking for parents of high school seniors. It's been interesting the last couple of years. I'm doing it with the seniors and their parents together. I've been doing it now at 7 different schools. And based on new information, asking parents, the kid's a senior in high school, why are you still doing their laundry? That was appropriate to be doing when they were younger. But new information, they're growing up. Where's the more responsibility? Why are you still doing that stuff? When you do that stuff for a kid, what you're saying to him is, I have no confidence in your competence. When you ask a kid to do things like that, what you're saying is, I have faith in you. On a resilience front, when a kid is upset and they go to their room, you don't immediately go to console, because we want them to learn how to manage intense negative emotion. Want them to learn to self-regulate. Now, as parents, we know when enough is enough. It's time to go, and we know our kids well enough. Okay? But the importance of giving kids a chance to learn how to manage that through self-regulation rather than external regulation, that's where this frontal cortex stuff begins to take shape, mature, and that's where the resilience and empathy stuff gets finalized. Next, to sustain. The sustaining part of discipline is probably the one that is most affected by things like sleep deprivation and too much screen time. If a kid is in lower school, the suggested amount of screen time is 7 hours a week. In middle school, it's 10 hours a week. And I haven't seen much about high school. Maybe they've just given up by then. But the American Academy of Pediatrics says that 80% of children are not getting enough sleep. And kids get just like we do when we don't get enough sleep. Irritable, short-tempered, easily annoyed, etc., etc. That's the way we get. The kids get the same. Next, to organize is, where is it stored in our file cabinet in our brain? This is the part of the brain that says that. Where do you go back to get it? What file cabinet is it in? What's it filed under? Where can you get it? As some of us are getting a little bit on the older side, we make lists because we know that that part of the brain is not functioning quite at the capacity it once was. So we compensate by making lists, by getting things done. So we got the temperament issue, we got the executive function, and then the connection issue. Connection starts with what we call motherese. It's the look that a mother has with her infant. If the mother and the infant do not share that look of connection, that motherese look, then you're probably going to run into some kind of attachment disorder. But if you got a 7-year-old that refuses to make eye contact with his or her mother, that same 7-year-old doesn't worry when mother gets upset, that is our best predictor for sociopathy or antisocial personality. Okay? That inability to stay connected, to look at somebody else in the eye. There are 4 components for connection. One is called primal empathy, which is sensing nonverbal communication, reading what's coming to you. That 93%. I know I belabor that. But one of the rules in family is dynamic always trumps content. Worked with a couple this morning, and they live in a fairly nice neighborhood. And he's an outdoor guy, so he's got a bass boat in the backyard, and he's got a pop-up camper in the backyard, and he's got a utility trailer in the backyard. Well, it doesn't fit in that particular neighborhood to have a bass boat, a pop-up trailer, and a utility trailer. It just doesn't quite go with that part of town, okay? And so she wants it out of there, and so they're fighting about it the entire time. What do we do about this stuff? It's important to him. They are not fighting about the trailers or the boat. They're fighting about who's in control. The dynamic is who is in control. And the reactivity in that relationship has nothing to do with the content. And then they wonder why we have the same conversation over and over and over again. It's because the conversation has nothing to do with content. It's all about dynamic. Stephen Stosny talks about the difference between empathy and compassion. He talks about empathy as the ability to feel on behalf of the other. Compassion is when I actually have the feeling. Okay? I will never be able to experience what it's like to be born blind. I will never be able to experience what it's like for a mother to nurse. I can have empathy for that, and I can go so far, but there's a place in which I can't go there. But empathy is enough, particularly if the person knows that's as far as he or she can go. So we got primal empathy, and then next is attunement. And I don't know how to make this is so simple that people don't get it. It's simply listening with full attention. How many times do we have a conversation where we're nodding our head and people know you're just not there? Yeah, you're listening, but you're not there. You're somewhere else. You're thinking about something else. You're obsessing about something else. So the sensing, where you see this in my office, is a spouse says something, and at the nonverbal level, 3 words into what they're saying, you see the spouse gathering their rebuttal. The moment the spouse is trying to gather their rebuttal to what the first person is saying, the first person at the nonverbal level knows he or she is no longer listening. And that's what they're responding to, not the content. The other attunement is listening with full. Where I see this one a lot too is in a couple where he or she says, we agreed that he or she would stay home when we had kids. Okay? And that was a full agreement that everybody participated. But one of them sees that as an irrevocable contract. When does that change? That no longer works for us anymore. We need to be doing something different. That was not a forever. But the big listening thing is the person who, and this is just as an example, the person typically who stays at home wants the one who has continued to work. You don't seem to listen to what I had to give up to be at home. You see me as just being able to, while the kids are at school, work out, do tennis, et cetera, go to Bible studies. But I gave up something about my professional identity. Desperately, can you just hear that? The power of just being heard is enormous. And yet, in our microwave culture, how little that truly happens. And then that takes us to the next one, which is empathic accuracy. Is the best key to successful marriage is when the empathy is accurate, when you understand the other's stuff. Where you see that most going awry is that if a child grows up in an abusive home, they tend to see anger and conflict everywhere. They tend to read it in because that's what's become familiar for them. And so somebody that's grown up in an abusive environment tends to see things in their spouse that are disapproving and frustrating, and the other spouse going, no, it's pretty matter of fact for me, but because of that history. Empathic, they're reading it wrong because of the history they grew up in. And then the final piece under this thing about connection is social cognition, is learning how the world works. Talk to lower school teachers, administrators. Kids who have really good manners are going to get a better education. It's just a given. Okay? But social cognition is also understanding more accurately how the others feel. I do at one of the schools, I do sexuality thing with 10th grade boys. They do a lot of sexuality with the genders together. This is a gender separate conversation. And talking to these boys, I will finish up by saying, well, what is one message you would want me to send the girls? And it's been so gratifying because over the last several years, and the groups do not know what the other group has told me, the boys will say, please tell them we're not jerks. Please tell them we don't know what we're doing either. You know? Because the girls sort of have pigeonholed the guys. Yeah, they just got one thing on their mind. Well, they're just as confused as the girls about that stuff. And then, of course, the distortion we get through TV, social media. Life does not get itself figured out by the end of an hour. Life does not get a resolution because this episode is over. And then the fourth piece has to do with self-awareness. I walk Radnor Lake a lot, as much as I can, not as much as I would like. But one of the things that I can tell about how much stress I'm under is how much I notice. There are times when I have walked Radnor Lake the entire trail, and I could not tell you anything I saw other than the trail in front of me. I was so obsessed about everything going on that I was trying to figure out. I did not notice the owls or the deer or the turkey or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so my own, and I just don't want to lay here at that level, is none of us is that self-aware. People that tell me they are an open book tend to be the most closed-off people I run into. Because none of us is that self-aware. But knowing how we function and how we affect the other when we're under stress and being self-aware. The two things that go out the window for me when I'm under a lot of stress is I lose my sense of humor and I internally get judgmental. When I do those things and I can't laugh much and I'm internally judgmental, it's not them, folks, it's me. Okay? But the effect on others, be quiet, Livy, but the effect that has on others is pretty profound. I'm not very nice to be around. You know, it doesn't go well for us. And then finally, support. Kids, now let me just tell you a story. I was on the board at Martha O'Brien, and we decided to do a grant for kids in the projects. And we were shooting for, what's that middle range, that small band? There are some kids that just seem to make it out of the projects, and there are some kids, unfortunately, probably not. But there's this middle band of what could we do with that would just sort of tip the balance, and they'd have a shot at a different kind of life. So we interviewed the police department and the school system and social services, et cetera, et cetera. The difference was clear and unanimous. It was one person believed in that kid. That's all it took. So when we wrote that grant, you had to commit to a 10-year relationship with the kid, which was pretty steep, obviously. But these kids had usually been abandoned so often that we couldn't let it happen again. Okay? But the significance of just being, I cannot tell you how many clients, fully functional people, that come out of very, very dysfunctional histories at best. And the difference was there was a teacher, there was a coach, there was a grandparent, there was an aunt, there was an uncle, there was someone outside the system who had confidence in their competence, believed in them, and would settle for nothing less. So what builds empathy and resilience? The biggie is delay of gratification. If you got kids, then all over the place. I need time to finish the laundry. I need time to finish this. I need time to finish that. I'll be with you in 5 minutes. I'll be with you in 30 seconds. I'll be with you in, et cetera, et cetera. The kid wants a new pair of this, that, and the other. Next weekend, even better, you come up with a way to earn your first part of that and we'll supplement the rest. But delay of gratification is every time there is a delay of gratification, it is like exercising the muscle in the front of the brain, both that whole area that has to do with empathy and resilience. As I just mentioned, believe in the kid. Number 3, do things as a family that expresses empathy. If we talk about spoiled kids, let's talk about the least spoiled kids. The variables for the least spoiled kids, the top one is kids that are asked to keep their rooms reasonably neat. I was surprised that was number 1, but that came up first. And I think the concept is that's not your room. That's your space to use and your space to maintain, which suggests to the kid that you participate in the management of our home. Okay? The second one are families that eat meals together with some regularity. These are the least spoiled kids. The third is family for whom there's a rich spiritual component. And the fourth is family that participate in some kind of charitable activity as a family. It's not that the parents volunteer and the kids do the fundraiser at school. It's we as a family pay attention to others. There's been a storm, we go pick up branches for the neighbor. Somebody's not feeling well, we as a family stop at Kroger and pick up a dozen cookies. Number 4, do not rescue. Worked with a school with 4th grade, and they were having trouble at recess. And it was soccer season. And kids were getting hurt. Kids were getting bruised feelings. It was rough. Parents were showing up at recess. And so the school said, would you come talk to the parent group? And I said, sure. And then that night it occurred to me, nobody was doing anything wrong. The hard drive and travel team soccer boys were just playing hard drive and travel soccer. The boys had said, heck, it's just recess. Can't we just kick the ball? And the nerds just wanted to read anyway. But nobody was doing anything other than their own thing. So I said, let me meet with the boys. So I met with 45 boys by myself. I said, just let me do it by myself, which I thought was gutsy. And we talked about sort of the standard with this is you don't spend a whole lot of time around the aggressive kid. You spend most of your time around the other kids, supporting the kid, and the kid needs to toughen up, and et cetera, et cetera. But most of the energy is not. And like I said before, bullying typically, teasing becomes bullying when the recipient's my kid. There's really not as much of it that goes around as we've thrown out there. So I hadn't intended to do this. But I said to the boys, let's just keep this in the room. Why don't we just fix that without telling your teachers and without telling your parents? Let's just get it done. And of course, the emails came in from the parents the next 2 days that I was telling kids not to talk to their mom and dad. Missed the point. But the point is, the boys fixed it. But then they started talking about what happens when the parents get involved in our stuff, and how much worse it gets, and how much longer it goes on. And how parents then end up not liking other parents. And how parents say, maybe we shouldn't have him over for a play date. And the boys got over it in 2 days, and the parents are holding on to it 6 months later. Okay. Well, that was kind of interesting. And so when spring came around, I was kind of fascinated by that. So I said, let me talk to the 4th grade girls, because some of that sort of pre-adolescent mean girl stuff was happening. And of course, being the girls, they had to talk about it a whole lot longer than the boys. And the same thing came up. What happens when your parents get involved? And they said, oh, it gets awful. It just gets so much worse. Now, there obviously is a point. But if you want your kids to have resilience, your starting place quite young is what are you going to do about it, not what am I going to do about it. How are you going to fix this? How are you going to make it work? What are your choices? You take your shot at it. You fix it first. If that doesn't, then maybe I'll come in behind you, but I'm not in the lead. The rule of thumb in lower school, we walk in front of our kids. In middle school, we walk alongside our kids. By the time we get to high school, we walk behind our kids. By the time kids are in high school, kid brings a dilemma to you. Your response is, I'm going to be real curious to see what you do with that. But you begin to diminish the advice. You begin to diminish coming up with the answers. They begin the process of sorting it out for themselves. Number 5, model empathy in adult relationships. Back to the marriage thing at home. What is it like, do you think, for the kids to be around you guys if you're in a relationship with a partner or spouse? What's it like? What are the kids observing? What are they experiencing when they're with you? And the other model empathy thing is kids don't miss anything. If you are driving down the highway and somebody pulls in front of you and you do road rage, what are you teaching the kid? Or you got somebody who is elderly and going about 12 miles an hour, and you know they're just being careful because they're elderly, et cetera, et cetera. How do you handle that? And what do your kids see you doing about that? What do they witness in that? Number 6, keep anxiety down. Number 7, perspective. What do we truly want for our kids? And then finally, I think I did mention this, but I'll mention it again. It's a really useful exercise. For the next week or two, back out to 10,000 feet. Be involved in your family, but back out and watch us. How is it we function? What is it like to be us? What happens when we're together? Are we a bunch of me's, or is there a sense of we and us? How do we treat each other? Is this a family where respect and support are the norm? Or is this a family where bickering and hitting and slapping and all that kind of stuff? Do they experience tension among us? Is taking a look at what is it like to be us, and then taking a look of what is it we need to do differently. You are in charge of establishing the culture of your family. If you default on that, then it'll happen to, it's sort of like in that same category. If you don't have any routines, that is your routine. Okay? But the whole notion of I really, in this day and time, of all the time I've been in this work, I think you have to be so intentional about what is the culture of us. I think good family, good parenting, good marriage swims upstream against the culture. As the culture's got us busier, got us faster, preoccupied, multitasking, do we stop and pay attention to who we are and what we're doing? That'd be it. Questions about anything? Well, not anything, but... Yeah, the reason it's such a difficult issue is because in most sort of good families, it's not an issue of culling out the bad stuff. It's how much stuff, it's good stuff, but how much of it is too much. And I pay a lot of attention, is there enough downtime? Where it gets tricky is that it is so sort of kid-specific. Some kids just do better if they're busy all the time, but that's not most kids. And so, you know, the whole notion, our culture set it up. If a kid's not doing a travel team by the time they're 7 or 8, they're never going to make a soccer team in high school. You know, if they're not, we're setting up this expectation that you got to start so young if the kid's got a chance. But that's not true. And so, what is it like? I think oftentimes for families, for parents, unfortunately, it's easier to keep the kids active than for us to have to struggle. What's it like for us all to be together? What are we going to do with each other? But the general, that's where I go about swimming upstream. The general rule that I see is the level of activity level in families is not kid-friendly to development. It's anxiety-producing. So, as a general rule, I err on the side of back it down and less. Other questions? Pardon?
The art of compartmentalization, separation of work and home life, and how you tell people to be fully present at home. They're not bringing their jobs and their issues and their problems. So they're physically present, but they're just not there because they're still working on their cell phones. They're not really listening to their spouse. They're not paying attention to their kids. So what are the ways to develop that separation?
It's a little bit of a tricky issue, but the starting place is how you think about it. Is you think about it not as a psychological issue, but as a skill to develop. Compartmentalization is a skill. Some people seem to be pretty good at it almost innately, but it has to be developed. You have to learn, for instance, gimmicks like talking. We have conversations in our head and our dialogues, and those are not hallucinatory. You talk back to it. No, I got. This is not your time. This is my time with my kids. This is my time with my family. This doesn't belong to anything other than where I am in the moment. And then the other thing is, other gimmicks people use is before they leave at the end of the day, write down the things they need to do the next day, and then sort of work at, I'm not going to think about this until I get here and pick this up in the morning. But there's a lot, and then for me, been a lot of people, particularly when they get to be about my age, they'll establish offices at home, and then sort of in the later years of their career, just do a few hours a week of counseling I could never do that. That'll never happen for me. I need to be able to close that door and leave it there. I'll be back in the morning. Yeah. So I'm typically not going to return phone calls at night. I'm not going to check email at night. You know, my answering machine will say, if this is an emergency, go to the hospital. Because I can't do that. And so you develop ways to be less available. I'm probably, Libby and I are getting ready to go on vacation Saturday, and I may be the only, because it's probably not a marketing tool, is my answering machine will the outgoing message says, this is the office of Jim Schleicher. Please do not leave a message. Which is probably not the best marketing, but, you know, it's kind of like, no, I don't want to have to, you know, call me next week when I'm in the office. I don't want to come back to 40 messages. So don't leave one. I think you develop your own set of skills on how to do that. I can't.
The husband is at work, you know, all day long, and he talks a lot, you know, throughout the day. And when he comes home, and, you know, his wife does not talk a lot throughout the day, he wants to talk. But he doesn't want to talk, he has to talk all day.
Well, and part of that goes to the biology of the male and female brain. Talking for women tends to be a stress reducer, and talking for men tends to be a stress inducer. And so we have to kind of negotiate that. Okay? What men particularly don't want to talk about is their day. You know, and very caring, interested, loving wives, tell me about your day. That's the last thing they typically want to talk about. Because I did it then, I don't want to do it anymore. Okay? And so oftentimes we'll talk about okay, well, let's spend a few minutes, but we're not going to spend the evening. You find that middle ground that meets both needs. When men feel fully connected with their wives, they will talk more than women. And so part of it is working on that connectional stuff, that listening, that accuracy, the empathy, et cetera, et cetera. Because when men get fully connected, they'll talk a heck of a lot more. Now, I don't see a lot of wives saying, I wish he'd shut up. But, you know, that doesn't happen a whole lot. But occasionally it does. There's some guys that are just incessant talkers. Yeah.
With the delay of gratification, are there appropriate amount of timing for certain age groups? And I realize that with older kids, you know, you can ask them to, but with younger children, you know, is there an appropriate amount that you should expect them to be able to do?
That's a good question, and that's where you gotta meet your kid where he or she is. You know, a younger kid may only tolerate, let me go to the bathroom first, and then I'll come back. Or let me go turn the stove off, I'll be back, which is maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds. So you got to start out with where the kid is, but then you want over time to extend that time. And as they get older, shift that. But again, you know, time for a 5-year-old doesn't have any meaning. When we say about 10 minutes, we know what that means. You know, a 4-year-old probably doesn't know what about 10 minutes means. We get a sense of that kids don't have that developed yet. So you just got to meet them where they are. But as a concept, it is the best and the simplest gimmick to get that going, and it's our best predictor for SAT scores and our best predictor for resilience. Yeah.
You're sad about screen time, reducing it. I mean, there's screens almost now in every phase. They're in the classroom and they're at home. Other than just turning it off, I mean, trying to reduce it. They learn through watching screens. They have computer class. They watch their shows. I'm just trying to figure, is there an exercise or something that you recommend other than just cold turkey?
I think, for instance, our entire family is going to have nothing to do with screen time between 6 and 8 o'clock. Okay? You set specific parameters that during this time, all of us, not just the kids. I quoted last week, 6 out of 10 parents are worried about the screen time, but 7 out of 10 kids are worried about their parents' screen time. Okay? So it's not a kid issue with screen time, it's a family issue. So we all take time out for X periods of time. Or Saturday in the morning, cartoons are fine, but at X time, we're off for a while because all of us are going to spend time, and we're going to spend a half hour cleaning this house up and getting it in order, and then we're all going to brunch. So I think you have to, it's just, and then it is difficult because particularly as the kid gets older, they really need their computer screen time because that's where their homework is. Yes and no. If you you still have a cutoff time, and the screens are brought to probably your room. Okay, is that because if kids, even if they're doing homework, it's at that sleep deprivation.
Right.
Okay.
So I'm just thinking longly. So going to college, like, is there some continuum? Is there some continuum through the high school years till they're 18, so that they learn to self-manage that a little bit? So when they go to college, they have some skills.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
It does, and kids are getting it. I think kids are getting better at this than parents. If you go to a restaurant, if you got 6-8 kids that are having dinner together, their cell phones will all be in the middle of the table. Because the biggie for kids is the FOMO, the fear of missing out. But if none of us have our phones, then I'm not missing anything. And so kids are figuring out their gimmicks. Because the kids are asking, when you talk to kids and they get real honest, they're sometimes even asking their parents, will you take this phone from me because I want to be able to tell my friends my mom took it? Because I don't want to have to say to my kid, I need a way to save face here.
Did you do that after they graduate from high school?
That's where it's so kid-specific. You're hoping by the time the kid gets to the junior year in there something, that the self-regulation is in place. Where I want to hit it is don't expect a 10, 12, 14-year-old to have the capacity to self-manage. So you incrementally work on it until they're a junior.
That was kind of
But it's with kids, in most anything we got, it's so much easier to let the leash out slowly than it is to let it out and try to yank it back in. Once you give a kid too much of that time and then you try to limit it, then you get withdrawal, much like you do addictions. One of the big things with kids is like, and it just happened, and kind of is that the first 2 months of school. Well, this year, let me just try it on my own, and then if it doesn't go real well, then we'll talk about whether or not we need to take your computer and all that. No, you do it the other way. First 2 months, you got nothing. If you handle that really well, we'll incrementally let it out. It's much easier to give the reward than it is to yank it away. Yeah, Glenn.
For all couples that you work with, can you identify the 3 most common issues that you see surfacing again for this demographic, 30s, 40s, and all the way there? The 3 areas that you say you see over and over in practice. I make everybody feel better.
I can't give you the 3, is it sex, is it money, that's not where the action is. The action is within the dynamic. And all I can do is go back to that thing I did last week, is when we get angry with each other and it looks like it's about something, it's valid, but it's an upper level emotion. Underneath that, it means we've been hurt and wounded. But the vast majority of marital issues are at the bottom 2 levels, feeling devalued, disrespected, and feeling anonymous and unknown. And probably when you feel devalued, disrespected, you feel anonymous, it's going to show as hurt, tearfulness, and frustration and anger. But that's not where the action is. You're not listening to me. You're not curious about me. You're not present with me. I'm not feeling respected. I feel like I am so low on the totem pole and everything else comes first. Your job is what you're married to. I'm your girlfriend if you got time on the side once in a while. And it's at that sense of, and replace, it can be the job, it can be golf, it can be the kids. And it can be. But I need to know that there is a space in your life where I am it. And I know that you are fully here with just me and that you really care about me. And I don't need that all the time. I'm not needy, I'm not insatiable, but I need to know there are some times where the only thing you're interested in, the only thing you're curious about, the only thing you want to value most in life is me. That's where the marital issues then show up. That's where it's seldom about sex and money and those things that they write books about. It's really about that dynamic. We have a desperate need, and it's so biblical. We have a desperate need to be known. Anything else? Yeah.
Books, do you have any recommendations of books for raising children or marriage or anything that you tend to recommend consistently?
No. They come out so fast, I can't keep up. And most books should be pamphlets. They got to make them so long to sell them as a book, but they ought to be a pamphlet. You can do that in 20 pages. So I don't know. I remember we were listening to Dr. Phil's book on CD. We're in the 3rd CD, and he's telling us what the book's going to be about. Well, thank you. You've been a great audience over the last weeks. That's it.